Welcome to the muscular system. This system is composed of all of our skeletal muscle that is attached to our bones. We will also talk about the cardiovascular muscle or cardiac muscle and smooth muscle briefly, but the muscular system really is the skeletal muscle that allows us to move. We need to understand muscles and the muscular system if we're going into any medical field. If you're interested in athletics, exercise, if you're a dancer, if you're going to be a trainer, all of these individuals have to understand a little bit about the muscular system. And also if you're going to be a massage therapist, I forgot to mention that one. So this figure from your textbook shows the amount of body weight associated with each organ system. And you can see that the muscular system is or comprises the majority of our body weight. So 44% of our weight comes from the muscles that are in our body. So what is important about muscle tissue? Muscle tissue is a certain type of tissue that allows us to convert the chemical energy, specifically of glucose, into ATP, and we do that through aerobic respiration, which you learned in Chapter 3. There are 3 types of muscle tissues, and we're going to focus again on the skeletal tissue, but there are cardiac and smooth muscles as well, and we will talk briefly about each of these. So muscle tissue or skeletal muscle is found everywhere in our body. The functions of muscle propels food along the GI tract. So the GI tract starts with our mouth and ends when we get to the anus. And we have skeletal muscle that controls the movement of the food from our mouth to our throat or our pharynx. We then have skeletal muscle again at the end of the GI tract. The external anal sphincter is composed of skeletal muscle that we control. We use muscles to expel waste from our body. We use muscles to allow air to enter our lungs. We use muscles to move our body. There are hundreds of muscles, skeletal muscles, close to or a little bit over 700, but we're only going to have to know, by we I mean you, are going to have to learn approximately 60 muscles. That's it. So we're not going to look at all the minute muscles. We're going to focus on those large muscles that do the majority of the work. And just to remind you, there is an H5P with all of those muscles and the activity of the muscle, the name of the muscle, and origins, insertions, all of that. There are different questions for all of those muscles. So skeletal muscle, its main job is to allow for body movements. It also helps in maintaining posture. So when we're standing erect or when we're sitting in a chair and we're not slouching, it's our skeletal muscle that's allowing that. Skeletal muscle functions in protection. So our abdominal cavity doesn't have a lot of bones surrounding those organs, but we do have muscles. And those muscles help to protect the organs that are deep to it. Skeletal muscle acts as a storage or sphincter, or I shouldn't say that. Skeletal muscles make up some of the sphincters in our body and help to control movement of materials. So we have an external anal sphincter, we have an external urethral sphincter, which we'll talk about next semester. And skeletal muscle, when it converts glucose or other nutrients to ATP, it does so, and in the process of it, it produces heat as a waste product. And the heat that is given off is what helps to warm our body up. So skeletal muscle has certain characteristics, has certain universal characteristics. All muscles are responsive to stimuli. So they're highly excitable. They're very similar to our nervous tissue. Neurons are also highly excitable, which we'll talk about in chapter 12. And muscle is able to conduct that information, that excitability, along its plasma membrane. Dudley Winters, sorry about that, that's my dog. Along the plasma membrane until it hits the internal region. So it can move that excitability along the cell. Skeletal muscle, or I shouldn't say skeletal muscle, muscle in a nutshell, has the ability to contract. So when it contracts, it shortens in length. It also has the ability to extend, so it's able to stretch out beyond its normal size. And then it is elastic, so it can go back to its resting shape. So you wanted me to use this type of PowerPoint, and I used this a couple of years back, so I have the study guide questions that you should be able to answer at this point. The basic purpose of all muscle tissue, not just skeletal muscle. The major, hold on a second. Dudley? All right. So at this point, you should be able to tell me the major functions of muscle tissue, the functions of skeletal muscle, so muscle tissue in general, and skeletal muscle specifically, and know the universal characteristics of muscle. Now let's look closer at what muscle looks like. So we're going to look at the structure of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is composed of thousands of muscle cells called muscle fibers. And they're arranged in bundles called fascicles. And so here you can see a fascicle of muscle fibers. There's an individual muscle fiber. And so this large muscle is composed of thousands of those muscle fibers. Around the entire muscle, around each fascicle, and around each muscle fiber, there's a connective tissue wrapping. These wrappings are known as the epimysium, surrounding the entire muscle, the perimysium, surrounding each fascicle, and the endomysium, surrounding each individual muscle fiber. These wrappings help in separating the muscle so that nerve impulses that stimulate one muscle fiber won't cause reactions to other muscle fibers, allow for sites for blood vessels and nerves to move in, and provide protection. And so each of the wrappings is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. I've already went over the layers, so I'm just showing you the things, okay? The endomysium is areolar connective tissue, and its major job is to separate each of those muscle fibers. Muscle is held to our bones by tendons. So this is the calcaneal tendon that attaches our gastrocnemius and our soleus to our calcaneal right here. And it helps in holding the muscle so that when we want to walk, we can move our feet properly. Some connective tissues are termed aponeuroses. These are flat sheaths, or I shouldn't say that. Some of the structures that connect muscles and bones, or muscles and to other muscles, are called aponeuroses. That's what I wanted to say. And so this is an aponeurosis on the hand or on the palm. And it helps in connecting the muscles of our digits to, or the muscles of our digits to our actual digits. Muscle is separated by fatty tissue known as fascia. So between our skin and the first layer of muscle, we have a superficial fascia, and between each layer of muscle, we have a deeper fascia. So here's superficial fascia, will be this fatty tissue between the skin, and then the deeper fascia is between each section or each type of muscle. This separates muscles, allows the muscles to work as their own muscle, and allows muscles to work in groups. Muscle is highly nutrient rich. It has a great vascularity. It also has nerves. Muscles work typically because nerves stimulate them. I say typically because cardiac muscle does not need nerve innervation to work, but nerves do encourage the cardiac muscle to work differently. So blood vessels move in through those epimysium and the perimysium, and they nourish the muscle. They also remove waste from muscle. And then the neurons innervate the muscles and can send signals to the skeletal muscle to tell the muscles to move. So, neurons have two basic processes, two types of processes, dendrites and axons. Axons are the extensions that move towards the skeletal muscle. And at the end, they have these tiny little end bulbs, axon terminals, and those terminals have neurotransmitters that will send signals or chemicals to stimulate muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle. What that means is our muscle moves because we consciously want it to move. Not all muscle is voluntary. Smooth and cardiac muscle are not voluntary. We do not have to think about our heart beating. We don't have to want our stomach to churn when we have food in it. It happens automatically. Voluntary muscle is something that we can control if we want to. So at this point, you should be able to tell me the three connective tissue wrappings that surround our muscles. And you should be able to tell me what a fascicle is, know what tendons and ligaments are, and what an aponeurosis is. Basically, I don't know if I said this, but an aponeurosis is a flattened tendon. So now let's look at the microscopic anatomy of muscle. Muscle, Dudley Winters. I think my dog wants to be part of this lecture. Dudley. He's a little barker, I swear. Dudders, come. There we go. All right, so the sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. So all cytoplasm for muscles is typically termed sarcoplasm. It contains all the different organelles, including the mitochondria, which is where we have ATP synthesis, ribosomes for proteins production, Golgi apparatus for protein movement, stuff like that. Skeletal muscle is multinucleate. That's very different from most of our cells. Most of our cells are uninucleate or only have one nucleus. But skeletal muscle is composed of myoblasts, and myoblasts are embryonic muscle fibers that, or the muscle stem cells, and what they do is they fuse together. Each myoblast contains its own nucleus, and so as they fuse together, they don't lose their nuclei. So when you have this full muscle fiber, it contains multiple nuclei. Surrounding the muscle fiber is a plasma membrane, just like all of our cells, but this plasma membrane is called a sarcolemma. Sarcoplasma inside of the cell, part of the or is the cytoplasm. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane. And the sarcolemma has invaginations. These invaginations are called T-tubules or transverse tubules. Just like all cells, the plasma membrane contains different proteins. Some proteins are gated and allow certain molecules in or out only when activated. And so along the sarcolemma, we have sodium pumps, we have potassium, or we have sodium channels that are gated, we have potassium channels that are gated. They only open when something stimulates the muscle fiber. And we have sodium-potassium pumps that continuously pump sodium out of the muscle and pump potassium back into the muscle. Within the plasma or within the cell, the sarcoplasm of the cell, we have a specialized endoplasmic reticulum called the Sarcoplasmic Reticulum. This is similar to the smooth endoplasmic reticulum of other cells, but it has a major function of holding calcium ions. So it acts as a reservoir for lots of calcium because we need calcium for muscle contractions to occur. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is directly associated with the T-tubules, so they're right next to those T-tubules or those invaginations. And so here you can see the plasma membrane, and here is a transverse tubule moving in. There's the sarcoplasm. There's your potassium channels and sodium sodium-potassium pumps. And as we move down that T-tubule, you see the sarcoplasmic reticulum right here. And so there's all this calcium here. And when calcium, or when an action potential moves along the T-tubules, it opens up calcium channels, and so calcium can leave and move into the sarcoplasm. And when calcium moves into the sarcoplasm, it can bind to muscle proteins called myofilaments, and muscle contractions can occur. So muscle fibers are composed of smaller structures called myofibrils. And myofibrils are composed of myofilaments. Myofilaments are the tiny proteins that actually make muscles contract. There are two basic types of myofilaments, thick filaments and thin filaments. So here's a myofibril. This entire thing is one muscle fiber, and you can see there are multiple myofibrils within one muscle fiber, and then within each muscle fiber there are multiple myofilaments, and these myofilaments are what actually cause the muscle contraction. They're the individual proteins for contraction to occur. So with the myofilaments, we have thick filaments. Thick filaments are very thick in structure, and that's why they get their name. The thick filament that we typically talk about is called myosin. Myosin has two binding sites, a binding site where it can bind to actin, and a binding site for ATP. When I think of myosin, I kind of think of golf clubs with multiple heads on it, because that's kind of what it looks like, to me at least. The thin filaments, there are a few of these that we talk about, are composed of actin, troponin, and tropomyosin. Actin are these little bead-like structures. And if you look, these beads kind of resemble what I think of as olives, where you have like that little pimento inside there. The little spots that I'm pointing at right now, those are the binding sites for myosin. And they're covered by this string structure, this green string. This green protein, myofilament, is called tropomyosin. And tropomyosin is also bound to troponin, and that's this blue structure. Troponin has a binding site up here for calcium. So tropomyosin and troponin are regulatory proteins, while myosin and actin are your contractile proteins. Tropomyosin covers the binding site and regulates muscle contractions. Troponin attaches to both the tropomyosin, and it can attach to calcium. When it attaches to calcium, it changes in configuration and pulls the tropomyosin off the actin molecule so that the myosin head can bind. And so here are the here's the myosin head, the ATP binding site, the actin binding site, the myosin binding site, the calcium binding site. So you have all these binding sites, right? And these are what control the muscle contraction. So how are these muscle myofilaments put together? They are composed of, or they are organized into structures called sarcomeres. A sarcomere runs from one Z line or disc to another Z line. And it has regions where there's only going to be myosin, and then other regions where there will be actin and myosin surrounding. So here's your myofilament. And we have different regions of the myofilament. We have an I band. The I band is where we only have thin filaments. The A band runs all the way from here to here. And this is where we have overlapping thick and thin filaments. So you can see thick and thin together. The H band is where we only have thick filaments. No thin filaments will ever be found there. And then we have this M line. So, and I've already, I've already talked about the I band and the Z disc, so I'm not going to mention them again. Here you can see everything a little bit even more closely related. So here we have thin filaments, and here we have thick filaments. So where we have overlapping thin and thick, that's the A band. Where we only have thick, that's the H zone. Where we only have thin, that's the I zone, or the I zoned. And then this is the Z disc. Z disc is where thin filaments are attached and originate. The M line is where thick filaments originate. We do have attached to the thick filaments, not regulatory, but structural proteins that help in controlling and maintaining the structure of the sarcomere. So what are these structural proteins? There are three that we talk about. Connectin and nebulin help in stabilizing and giving structure to the sarcomere itself. Dystrophin is probably the most important one, because what dystrophin does is it links the myofilaments to the endomysium of the muscle fiber. And so this is what allows us to have a muscle contraction and actually see the muscle contraction occur. If the myofilaments are contracting but they're not attached to anything, it's just movement inside of a tube, and that tube's never going to move. So this is probably the most important of the structural proteins. Dystrophin is important because when you have mutations in the dystrophin protein, it can cause diseases known as muscular dystrophies. And these are degenerative muscle diseases that cause the muscles to be unable to contract. Because they don't get used, they are replaced by fatty tissues and scar tissue or fibrosis. And this limits the ability for body movement, and will eventually lead to death of the individual. So one of the most common forms of muscular dystrophy is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is I have sex-linked. It's not sex-linked, that's the wrong word. It's an X-linked recessive disorder. It's seen in males more often, which is why a lot of people say it's sex-linked, but it's not. It's linked to the X chromosome. And because males only have one chromosome that is X, if they have a recessive chromosome, they have the disease. Females can only have the disease if they have two X chromosomes with the recessive alleles on it. And that typically doesn't happen because as the child gets older, their muscles atrophy and form fatty tissue and fibrosis tissue. This typically leads to children being wheelchair bound by the age of 10, and before they are sexually active, they typically are dead. So males tend not to pass on their genes, which means we don't have very many females that have this disease. But it's still not as sex-linked, it's still an X-linked disease. So at this point, you should be able to tell me what the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber is known as, what smooth muscle endoplasmic reticular of a muscle fiber is known as, and what the function of the smooth muscle endoplasmic smooth endoplasmic reticulum is. You should be able to tell me what, or you should be able to identify different regions of a sarcomere. If I have them labeled, I should be able to say, here's, a sarcomere. What is this part? What is this? What occurs here? What type of myofilaments are here? You should be able to tell me, I already said that, the purpose of the smoothie are. You should be able to tell me what the sarcolemma of a muscle fiber is known as, what T-tubules are, and you should be able to tell me the importance of the dystrophin protein and what happens when the dystrophin protein is mutated. I'm going to stop here for this lecture and get this posted, and then we'll do the nerve-muscle relationship in the next video, okay? Bye.